element.
Welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast with your host, Dr. Randy Cook.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Prescription for Success podcast. I'm Dr. Randy Cook, and I'll be your host. Please remember that Prescription for Success is produced with support from MD Coaches, a professional coaching service empowering physicians and other healthcare professionals to realize a greater potential and to achieve a greater level of satisfaction in their chosen fields. My guest today is Dr. Robert Baker, who practiced internal medicine and gastroenterology for 35 years in Long Island. He was an honors graduate at Princeton University, where he earned his undergraduate degree. From there, he went on to Columbia University College of Physicians and Surgeons, where he received his MD. Afterward, he completed a gastroenterology fellowship at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston before returning to New York to establish his private practice. Dr. Baker has a particular interest in the doctor-patient relationship, and he has published a book on that subject entitled The Performance of Medicine: Techniques from the Stage to Optimize the Patient Experience and Restore the Joy of Practicing Medicine. The subject of the book is informed by his experience as a professional magician and ventriloquist. And although I'm fairly certain that Dr. Baker is not the only physician that occasionally moonlights as a ventriloquist, I am fairly certain he's the only one ever to appear on America's Got Talent. So now let's hear my interview with Dr. Robert Baker. Well, Dr. Robert Baker, Bob, if I may be so informal, I want to begin by saying welcome to Prescription for Success, and thank you so much for being here today.
Randy, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and to your listeners.
Well, I'm really looking forward to it as well, Bob. You have a story that is decidedly a little different from most of the physicians that we talk to, and I think the audience is going to be really interested to hear this. It's a little difficult to know where to begin. So what I'm going to do, I think, is sort of begin in the middle. I'm going to start with your medical education and something that I thought was really interesting. You got your undergraduate degree from Princeton, bachelor's degree in psychology. In fact, during your undergraduate years, you worked on and eventually published a paper about lesions of the foveal prestriate cortex in rhesus monkeys. That spells experimental psychology to me all over the place, but yet just a few months after graduating from Princeton, you were in medical school. So how did that take place?
When I was in college, I was trying to decide whether to major in biology, biochemistry, or psychology, because they all interested me. And in the Department of Psychology at Princeton was Professor Charles Gross, who was doing really fascinating work in physiologic psychology, in the physiology of the brain, experimenting on rhesus monkeys, which of course now is something which is perhaps frowned upon, but in the day, it was something which was regarded as being quite normal. And the work that he was doing was so exciting to me, and he was such an engaging personality that I said, this is the man that I want to work with, as opposed to the department that I want to work in. Professor Gross subsequently went on to do really extraordinary work in neuroanatomy and neurophysiology. He was the first person to describe the fact that in rhesus monkeys, there were specific neurons that were triggered by a monkey looking at a hand. In other words, there were specific neurons in the monkey brain for watching what hands were doing. These neurons were not triggered by just looking at another monkey or looking at food. It was only by a hand that triggered them. So he went on to a very, very distinguished career, and unfortunately just passed away at the age of 81 a few months ago. But he was a very big influence in my life. He really taught me what science was all about. He was rigorous. He demanded the best of all the people who worked in his lab, and yet with a certain kindness to it that really influenced me. So I would say that Professor Gross was really one of my early influences. And I always knew that I wanted to go to medical school, but it was with him that I spent 2 years and a summer of my undergraduate life doing research.
Well, that's a very interesting story. In fact, I was going to go back and ask you if medical school was always the aim, and obviously it was, but this is a rather unusual way to get there, don't you think?
Yeah, it was unusual because many of the people who were applying to medical school did major in biochemistry or biology, but I decided to go through psychology, A, because it interested me, and also because I thought it made me a little bit different from everybody else who would be applying at the time. But I really wanted to be a doctor since I was a young child. And I can see all of the different influences that came together. Perhaps the most influential of all was when I was living in Highland Park, Illinois. And as a youngster, I got frequent ear infections. And our family pediatrician, Dr. Elmer Cattison, was a man who was incredibly dedicated to his patients. And I distinctly remember one night in the middle of the night, he came to see me with an ear infection, and he had actually just thrown his overcoat on over his pajamas. And that's the way he came. Now, that's what the physicians did in that day. And not only that he was that dedicated, which I remember my parents remarking on, but also he was so soothing. He gave me what we called in the Midwest a sucker, what we call in the East a lollipop to soothe my throat. And he gave me some penicillin. It actually wasn't penicillin. It was aureomycin, which is a form of tetracycline, which he had in his bag. He gave that to me right away. Unfortunately, for which I can thank the medication for some staining on my teeth that I have as an adult. But okay, we didn't know that then. But he gave me the medication. He gave me the lollipop. He was soothing. And I remember lying in bed thinking, well, I want to be like him. So I actually went to medical school, or thought I was going to go to medical school, with the intent of being a pediatrician, not an internist. And one of my professors, a physics professor at Princeton, was talking to me about this. He was a cranky old British guy named Eric Rogers. And one day he said to me, well, you know, Baker, pediatrics is not the treatment of children. It's the treatment of their parents.
So true.
Which gave me pause, I have to say. But I did go to medical school hoping to be a pediatrician. And that was also formative because when I was doing my pediatrics rotation, for me, and only for me, I found that when the kids were well, it was a little bit boring. And when they were sick, it was depressing. And you know, we rotated through Babies Hospital at Columbia Presbyterian then, and I took care of very, very sick and dying children, which was profoundly affecting to me. And at the same time, I did very well in my internal medicine rotation. I thought, okay, I think I'll take care of adults. Just dealing with kids was just too hard for me.
So actually, at the time that you began medical school, you had an idea that it was going to be pediatrics, but you hadn't really decided what the goal was going to be precisely. Is that right?
Yeah, I didn't really know what pediatrics was about, other than Professor Rogers warning about it. And also, I was and am very much interested in performing magic, sleight of hand. And I envisioned myself doing magic for the kids in the office. And I think that was another part of the appeal to me, attracting me to pediatrics.
It's interesting to me, and I'm interested to know if you have seen the same sort of thing. I think back when you did your initial training and I did my initial training, and you and I are pretty much contemporaries.
So you were taught how to use leeches as well as I was, I presume.
Yeah, all that kind of thing, and spider webs.
Yeah,
whatever.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it seems to me that I and a number of people around me, when I began medical school, had not really sort of closed the book on what the end game would be, and just kind of stuck to that. I was still looking around and kind of taking a look at everything. And it seems to me that nowadays, a lot of kids, if I can call them that, when they start to medical school, have already made up their mind what the specialty is going to be, which I think is rather unfortunate. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
It's interesting you say that. I remember the first day of medical school, they had us fill out forms in which they asked us what we would like to do eventually in our medical careers. After we filled out the forms, they said to us, well, 3/4 of you will change your minds. So I just knew, Randy, that I wanted to be a doctor. And as I said, I wanted to be a pediatrician, but being a doctor was a dream of mine all my life. And yes, of course, there were the little side excursions. When I was, I think, 9 years old, I thought maybe I wanted to be a railroad engineer because I thought that would be a cool job. I flirted with the idea of being a professional magician for a while, till I realized that would be a very peripatetic life with no real stability. But the desire, the dream of being a doctor was always there, even though, of course, I only knew what a doctor was from the romantic point of view, from seeing Dr. Caddison as a child, from watching Ben Casey and Dr. Kildare on TV. And it was really only when I got to medical school that I began to realize what a serious and difficult undertaking it was. I still remember the very first words of the very first lecture in medical school. It was by Dr. Ernest April. He was our professor of anatomy, and his opening words were this, quote, "Good morning. This is anatomy. I am Professor April, and as of this moment, you are 1 week behind."
Wow.
And he was right.
I guess that got your attention.
Yes, it did. And he started lecturing about the upper extremity. I thought, holy cow, I didn't even know there were that many nerves, muscles, and bones, and I have to know everything about them. So yes, it was an awakening. But also it was exciting to realize that I'd be learning a whole new language. I'd be introduced to a world that I really knew nothing about. And that fascination with medicine and the wonder of medicine and the wonder of the human body has stayed with me all these years.
And I'd like to follow up on that just a little bit. So it sounds like you, as was the case with myself as well, in your family, you had no one around you that was in any way connected with the medical field at all. My dad was a school teacher, for example.
That's correct. The closest I had was my father's cousin when I was young and living in Illinois. I was going to the University of Chicago Medical School, and he would come to visit us in the suburbs. And I remember him bringing his microscope and pricking my finger with a lancet and looking at my blood under his microscope. And that must have been no more than 7 or 8 years old.
Wow. Did he have you sign a release for that?
No, he didn't. And he's still alive. I really ought to bring that to his attention. But that was, again, one of these multiple factors that contributed to my wanting to be a doctor.
Let's follow that a little bit more. Eventually, the decision was made that you were going to go into internal medicine and eventually gastroenterology. How did you make that decision, and what was the path like?
The decision was made for me by my unconscious mind. Like many residents, I kept a big file folder of articles which I ripped from journals so that I could teach the interns and the residents behind me and have these articles to refer to. And one day I was going through my files and I noticed that the gastroenterology file was much thicker than the cardiology file or the rheumatology file or the endocrinology file. And I said, I guess I'm really interested in this stuff. And then one of the former residents, then fellows, who became a fellow in GI at New York Hospital where I was training, invited me to watch an upper GI endoscopy. And he had a little extra scope that I could look through and watch the procedure with him. And then at the end, he even let me withdraw the endoscope through the esophagus. And I thought, this is the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life. That's it. I'm going to be a gastroenterologist.
And that was, actually, you're just a little bit younger than me, but even so, endoscopy at that point was a relatively new thing. And I think not necessarily all of the gastroenterologists that you would have run into were actually endoscopists. Many of them were just experts in digestive diseases and so forth. And
you're bringing that up is as if you read my mind, because There was a physician at New York Hospital named Dr. Herman Steinberg, who was, I would call, a grand old man of gastroenterology. He was, I like to describe him, he was old, he was bent, he was exceedingly cranky and unbelievably good with his patients and unbelievably knowledgeable about gastroenterology. And when I told him I wanted to do GI, he looked me square in the eye and he said, "Baker, you're going to have to decide if you still want to be a doctor or just a plumber." And you know, Randy, those words have stayed with me all my career, and I've always tried to remain a doctor and not just a proceduralist. And I think one of the sad things in GI these days is that some people are becoming proceduralists. They do many unbelievable procedures, things that Dr. Steinberg and I never could have imagined 35, 40 years ago. But I think it's important never to stop being a doctor, a physician. And I think that's one of the reasons that I decided to do internal medicine in addition to gastroenterology, so I could have a view of the whole patient and not just the tube running from the mouth to the anus.
That really is a profound thought, and I think it really says a great deal about how the practice of medicine has evolved since you and I trained, because you're exactly right. There is a great deal of interest in either doing procedures or getting the patient to someone who can do a procedure. And my own opinion, and it sounds like we agree on this, that the artistry of making a connection with the patient has sort of been moved to the back burner. Would you agree?
I completely agree. And that's why in my new speaking career, I talk to doctors and nurses and other healthcare professionals about the importance of the doctor-patient connection, because I really believe that the magic of healing, the magic of medicine, begins with the doctor-patient connection. And many of us went into medicine with compassion, out of the desire to help people. And the more we get away from that, I think, the harder it is for us to be complete physicians. And that's whether we're surgeons or gastroenterologists or internists or pediatricians. It always has to be about the patient.
Absolutely. All right. Well, now I'm going to shift the focus a little bit now, because in addition to being a very successful gastroenterologist, 29 years in practice.
Actually, 35.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, 35.
My goodness, you have impugned my research abilities, but thank you for the correction.
No, I did not mean to impugn. Just to let people know, I really am as old as I sound.
I see. Well, you, in addition to your interest in science and your addition in medicine, or your interest in medicine, you have had an interest in performance art for quite a long time, actually going back to your childhood. Am I correct about that?
That's right. I wanted to be a magician even before I wanted to be a physician. And I actually started off as a ventriloquist around age 8 or 9, then drifted into magic from there. I paid for a significant amount of my college and later medical school expenses performing at private parties and in the Catskill Mountain resort areas of upstate New York. I have maintained that interest all these years, including an appearance on America's Got Talent in season 8, which is back in 2013. So although I never directly brought my magic and performing into the office, I always maintained an activity in that all my life. And it's something which I truly enjoy. It's a hugely great feeling to entertain other people and listen to them laugh.
You started that at a fairly early age, and I would imagine, and we're going to talk some more about your act in a moment, but I would imagine that the very nature of magic and ventriloquism obviously demands a substantial amount of rehearsal and practice and time. Did you have to sort of put that on the back burner or just step away from it entirely while you were training, or what was that like?
I did have to put it on. Yes, it's a very good question. You know, they're both performing arts. just like playing the piano is a performing art or dancing or singing, and they require that level of dedication. And really, looking at myself honestly, one of the reasons I decided not to become a professional performer is that I don't think that I had it in me to give it the years of study and dedication and total devotion to come out at the very top of the field. I knew David Copperfield when he was 17 years old, the probably the world's most famous and arguably one of our greatest magicians ever. And I remember we were standing in a magic shop in New York City, and I was in medical school at this point, and he was talking about dropping out of college to be a magician. And I said, you shouldn't do that because it's very hard to make a living in show business, and you should at least go to college and have a backup. Well, I guess I was wrong in his case, but he was incredibly dedicated. He lived magic, he breathed it. And artists that I've known in other fields, be they dancers or musicians, needed to live and breathe their art. And I didn't have that degree of dedication to magic, but I did feel that I had it for medicine. So you're absolutely right. I did have to back burner it. I went for many years without performing publicly, but I never gave it up.
So eventually you did bring back performance to fill at least some space in your life. And I'm wondering, was it, would you say it was your relief valve from medical practice, or did it serve some other purpose?
I never saw it as a relief valve so much as simply another part of my life that I enjoyed doing. It was, like my kids were not a relief valve from medicine. It was just another part of my life, and performing has always been that way for me. I've been a performer since I was 8 years old. It's what I do. And it's just something else that I enjoy. So I guess there's some doctors who play golf and some doctors who like to cook and others like to do woodworking, whatever the case may be. But for me, it was performing.
So let's get into some of the details of your performance. I know you have an entire cast of characters. Would you like to tell us about some of those?
Yes, I do. I have my original character, who was carved for me when I was 16 years old, who's sort of I like to describe him as a 14-year-old with a 42-year-old mind. There's Mrs. Lucille Goldman, whom I describe as elderly, angry, and on the prowl. So she enjoys flirting with the younger men in the audience.
I've seen Mrs. Goldman. She is a little crotchety.
That's putting it kindly. Yes, she is. And where that personality emerges from, I have no idea, but there she is. I guess the one, if I had to say it was quote unquote famous for anyone, it would be for sigmoid colon, the world's only talking large intestine. And it was with sigmoid colon that I appeared on America's Got Talent.
So tell us a little bit more about that. How does one get on America's Got Talent? I know you had a fairly high-profile patient, and I'll let you decide if you want to give us the details on that. But it would seem to me that getting on that television show is a little bit of a long shot, and yet you did it.
Well, thank you. Yes. Let me state at the outset that one of the judges, Howard Stern, was my patient for 25 years. Now, you might say, am I not violating HIPAA by revealing that? The answer is no. He talked about me by name to his 25 million listeners, so I guess I can talk about it to your 25 million listeners.
From your mouth to God's ears.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Anyway, but when I auditioned for America's Got Talent, I did not tell Howard that I was going to audition. I submitted a tape. And I position myself as a gastroenterologist with a talking colon. And I think that was such an unusual story. They liked the idea. So I auditioned first for the producers, and then for the executive producers. And then eventually they told me I'd be auditioning for Howard and the other judges. And 2 days beforehand, I went in to do taped interviews with the people there. And the executive producer came to me and said, we know about your relationship with Howard. We see a conflict of interest. We cannot let you win the $1 million. And I said, honestly, I didn't think I was going to win the $1 million. But I had thought about this ahead of time, and I had an answer ready. I said, suppose Howard recuses himself and let the other judges decide. And he thought about it for a moment or two. And he said, okay, we can do that. So the day of the audition, I'm waiting backstage to go on. And my personal producer, because each act has a producer, says, okay, here's what's going to happen. You're going to go out on stage and Howard's going to pretend to be surprised to see you. And then Howie Mandel is going to raise a question as to whether this is legal because you have a relationship. Is it fair to the other people? And then we're going to call in a team of lawyers, and the team of lawyers are going to consult. And then they're going to decide that, yes, Howard can recuse himself, and then you can audition. Really? Okay. Step out on stage, and you can watch it on YouTube. And there's Howard laughing and saying, I have to admit to everybody, this man is my personal physician. Gets a lot of laughs out of it. They had the lawyers come out. That part was not shown on TV. And I auditioned. The audition went very, very well. The audience was laughing so hard they had to keep stopping to let the laughter die down. So the first judge to speak was Heidi Klum. And she said, oh, I liked it. I want to see more. And then Mel B, who I think was Scary Spice in the Spice Girls, said, well, I didn't get it. I didn't think it was funny. And I remember thinking on stage, it's a gastroenterologist with a talking colon. What do you not get about that? And then Howie Mandel said, well, this show is really for people who have been struggling in the trenches for 20 years, and that's not really you, so I'm going to vote no. And then Heidi Klum voted yes, and Howie turned to Mel B and said, all right, it's up to you. Well, I was sure that she was going to say no because she did not like the act. Before she could speak, the audience started cheering and stomping their feet and yelling, Vegas, Vegas, because the next step was to go on to perform in Las Vegas. And she turned around in her chair to look at the crowd, which is in the Hammerstein Theater in New York, and there was 4 levels of balconies, and the screaming got louder, Vegas, Vegas. And she turned back to me with a big smile on her face, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to put me through. And before she could say a word, the executive producer came running in from the side, waving his hands in the stop movement, waving his hands across each other, clamped his hand over her microphone, said something to her, and walked off, whereupon she voted no. If you watch the clip, you will see Howie vote no, and then she'll vote no, and then Heidi Klum says, sorry. Actually, what happened was after Howie and Mel voted no, Heidi smiled and looked up at me and said sorry, because she was sorry that I wasn't going to continue. But that's not how they showed it. And what I learned about reality television is that the reality is what the producers want the reality to be. And
I guess we shouldn't be surprised about that. I mean, after all,
no, because they're trying to make an entertaining TV show. In fact, my wife at the time was furious because they posted me as Howard Stern's poop doctor, and they made all sorts of jokes about that. And she said, they humiliated her. I said, no. I have a good day job. This doesn't mean anything to me. And I got to do ventriloquism on TV in prime time for 11 million people. So I'm perfectly happy.
That's pretty exciting.
It was fun. And I like to say in my website, in my speeches, that I'm quite sure that I'm the only Princeton, Columbia, Cornell, Harvard-trained physician to have appeared on America's Got Talent. So I do have that unique credential.
I would imagine. Yeah, that's a pretty high bar. Well, Bob, this has been really fascinating. We talk to a lot of physicians on the show. We hear a lot of stories, but if we ever give out an award for the most unique story, I think a guy that performs as a talking colon is probably going to be at least in the top 10.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I may also have been the only physician ever to do magic for Bedouin nomads who thought what I was doing is real. That's a story for another time.
That sounds like a great story. Well, it's been great talking to you, and what I'd like to do at this point is move along to what I really consider to be my favorite part of the show, and that is where we invite our guests to share with us their prescription for success. So I'm going to close my mic, and I'm going to sit quietly while Dr. Bob Baker gives us his prescription for success.
Thanks so much, Randy. I really appreciate the opportunity. I think the most important thing for doctors to remember is that despite all the difficulties of becoming a doctor, despite all the stresses and hassles of everyday practice, despite what we have to put up with the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical companies and the demanding patients and the tremendous hours that we put in and the psychological and physical drain on us, what I hope the doctors will remember is that when we look back on our careers, it will certainly be true that we will not have, say, sold the most widgets or moved the most product or won the most cases, or we certainly will not have made the most money. But there will be thousands and thousands of people whose lives are better because they met us. That's the best job in the world. There's just simply nothing better that I can see that one can do with one's life than that. So my thoughts for success and my prescriptions for success are these, that if you're a clinician, you won't really know that you've been successful until you look back on your career and you ask yourself, well, am I leaving the world a better place? Did I serve my patients selflessly and well? And again, are their lives better because they met me? If you can answer all of those questions, yes, you'll have had a very successful life. But it's also important not to get hung up on the notion of being the best. Because the fact is, I've discovered by going through many selective schools that no matter how smart or hardworking or skilled or dedicated I thought I was, there are always going to be people who are smarter or harder working or more skilled or even more dedicated. And so long ago, I decided that the only standard that should matter is being the best you that you can be at what you do, and then spend a lifetime striving to live up to that standard and no other. But I don't want people to think that the prescription for success is only about being a doctor. I also think that a clear marker of success is the type of adults that your children grow up to be. And if your values as a physician are translated to your values as a person, and if your children incorporate those values, learning from you by example and by your teaching, then I think you would have succeeded mightily in life, as well as being a doctor. And then the last prescription that I have is always to be humble, to appreciate that the body has great abilities to heal itself, and that's sometimes despite what we do to it, not necessarily because of it. And to remember that the vast amount of knowledge that we have and that we're gaining every single day about how the human body works is just dwarfed by how much we don't know. So never cease to wonder at the marvels of the human body, always trying to understand it better, and along with the human beings inside those bodies. I appreciate, Randy, your giving me the opportunity to expound on these things. They're things which I feel and believe very, very deeply, and if they're of some use to even one of your listeners, well, that would be really great.
Well, there's a lot of wisdom there, Bob, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today and share your prescription for success with us. Before we go, I want to give you an opportunity to tell everybody what you're doing now. You're retired from active practice, of course, but I believe that you have kind of taken the act on the road. Maybe there's some books you'd like to tell us about, websites, email addresses, that sort of thing. What have you got for us?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Randy. Yes, I now speak to doctors, nurses, and other health professionals about restoring the joy of practicing medicine and improving the patient experience.
That's a great idea. Are you having any success with it?
Yes, I am. I've been speaking all over the country and even internationally. So yes, this has been a wonderful second career for me. My website is drbobbaker.com. That's DRBOBBAKER.com. We're working on a new website, but the old one's good enough for the moment. So I certainly am available for speaking. And I'm very proud of the book which I wrote, which is called The Performance of Medicine, Techniques from the Stage to Optimize the Patient Experience and Restore the Joy of Practicing Medicine. It is available on from your favorite online monopolistic store. You can guess which one that is. But it's called, as I said, it's called The Performance of Medicine by Bob Baker. It's been very, very well reviewed, and people seem to like it. And I wrote it so that it would be fun to read. It's not just for doctors and nurses. Really, anybody could learn its lessons, but I sure do appreciate it when people read it and post a review, whether they like it or not. So far, nobody's not liked it, but that can always change. But anyway, yeah, I think people find it a useful guide full of practical strategies and techniques to really restore the joy of practicing medicine and help give our patients an even better experience than we already do.
Well, Dr. Bob Baker, physician and performance artist, very unusual combination. I have really enjoyed talking with you today. And once again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Randy, for the opportunity and for asking just the right questions to allow me to spout off a little bit.
And that will bring us to the close of another episode of Prescription for Success. Remember, you can subscribe to our show and glean more insight about my guests by reviewing the show notes on our website, rxforsuccesspodcast.com. That's rxforsuccesspodcast.com. And we'd love it if you would leave us a comment or a question, and I'll read those on the air from time to time. Finally, if you'd like to help support the show and gain access to members-only content, you can become a patron at patreon.com/RX for Success podcast. That's patreon.com/RX for Success podcast. Thank you so much for listening today, and don't forget to fill your prescription for success with my next episode.